Okay, I think we'll get started. Not least because there's probably some people sitting online going, when are they going to start? All right, welcome online people. We're going to start. Okay, so welcome to this amazing panel on facial recognition. It's terrific to have you here. This is mostly just going to be discussion, but we do have some amazing talents up on the panel here. But let's just start by thinking a little bit about what's going on with facial recognition. So, I'm Kim Weatherall, by the way. I figure you all know that by now, because they keep putting me up, you know, in front of the people to open conferences and stuff. I'm Kim Weatherall. I am a Professor of Law here at the University of Sydney. Once upon a time, there were many places to be anonymous. The public street, the public park, was a place to wander around where, for the most part, you could go unnoticed, unknown. Famously too, the internet was a place where no one knows you're a dog. Sorry, that's the one for its veterans in the room. But of course that didn't last long. The commercialised internet rapidly became a place where we were, where we are, constantly identified, tracked, surveilled, classified, targeted. And what it seems now increasingly is happening is that capacity and tendency to attach names and faces in the digital world is now extending out to the physical world. The epitome of this, of course, is Clearview AI, the company that scraped social media photos with names attached to create a system designed to identify people in the street. Strikingly too, our face has become a tool we use to navigate our lives in new ways. Increasingly, it opens our phones, admits us to secure workplaces, confirms our presence at workplaces or maybe at examinations. It's urged as a mean to mark our school attendance or absenteeism. Emotion recognition is touted as a means to make us better teachers by tracking attention or perhaps confusion or boredom. So the technologies promise a means to navigate information overload, do our jobs better, make our lives more convenient. And so here we are in a bit of a dilemma. This shift to always-on identifiability is notoriously conflictual, conflicted, challenging. On the one hand, there are these conveniences, and there's the public safety argument, right? The means to find the abducted child or the dangerous criminal. On the other hand, it's a means to profile, to track, to invade our privacy. And the evidence that I could see, you know, doing a bit of a look around before today, is that people feel conflicted about this. You know, the OAIC 2020 Community Survey on privacy had some really interesting results, with Australians kind of split down the middle on what they like or don't like about the use of biometric information. Some of the most interesting information in that survey is when you go down into what FRT is used for, facial recognition technology. Only 25% of Australians were comfortable or somewhat comfortable with with the use of facial recognition technology to shop in a retail store or go to a licensed pub or bar. Admittedly, I find that confusing. Like, a quarter of Australians think it's quite okay to enter a pub using a face recognition, but there you go. It's also notable that there are moves internationally to regulate facial recognition. Some US moratoria, but best known being the EU AI Act, which in its latest compromise version has quite extended prohibitions and controls for biometric information that we can talk about in more detail later. So there's action and there's a bit of a conflict, I think, between competing interests, competing rights, competing views, competing desires around the uses of these technologies. And what that means to me is that we really need to talk about it, which is why we're here today, which is great. Consumer organisation Choice, represented on our panel today by Kate Bauer, has been doing an amazing job in recent times of unearthing and bringing to public attention the growing use of facial recognition technology in our lives and in our everyday environments. Last year, their investigation of Kmart and Bunnings, this year stadiums, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about it. Professor Ed Santow too, immediately to my left, is a tireless champion for this public discussion. As Human Rights Commissioner, he led the Human Rights and Technology inquiry that urged a moratorium on this technology until a legislative framework could be established. As a current founder and co-leader of the Human Technology Institute at UTS, with his colleagues Nicholas Davis and Lauren Perry, he took this a step further and actually developed and proposed a framework law, which they released late last year. Jake Goldenfein is a CI with ADM+S and a researcher at the Melbourne Law School, working across a range of issues at this intersection of law and technology, but especially here, raising broader questions around the infrastructures of facial recognition. So I'm going to turn first to Kate to talk to us from Choice about what's been going on in your world around facial recognition.
Thank you, and thanks for inviting me, and also with these very esteemed panellists. So I think I will explain a little bit how Choice came to be working on facial recognition, because I think we're kind of perhaps taking a different approach maybe than the human rights angle or the legal angle. So Choice is Australia's largest consumer organisation. We've been around for more than 60 years. Most people know us when they want to go and buy a fridge, like who's been opening and closing the door and checking what the temperature is over 60 hours, that's going to be Choice. So we're not traditionally known for working in the space of emerging technology, but a couple of years ago, when we were considering what would be the issues that we think most impact consumers now and into the future, we determined that data use and technology was going to be one of those areas where consumers would be impacted significantly, and that the risks were increasing. And from that, my team was created. And one of the things that I've tried to think about, you know, Choice's purpose is to fight for fair, safe and just markets. So what does that mean when we're talking about data, and what does it mean when we're talking about technology and the way it interacts in consumer spaces? And this is kind of how we ended up working on the facial recognition. So actually, one of the approaches that I have, one of our priority areas is automated decision making in essential markets, which I include retail. And obviously that's kind of one of the key consumer spaces is where you buy goods and services. So actually, like most good Choice investigations, the story started with a tip-off. So one of our staff members actually had a sister-in-law who went into Kmart who tried to return something. And they said, oh, we'll just need to check the facial recognition cameras to make sure you didn't steal it. And she said, what? Excuse me, the what? And that was kind of like the first that we had heard about it. And so that kind of led me to the conclusion that, in fact, also as a Kmart shopper myself, most people probably hadn't heard about this, probably didn't know about it. And then that kind of led me to a full investigation. So we looked at 25 kind of leading retailers. And really, we just did super basic investigative journalism. Like, we just looked up their privacy policy and sent them a bunch of questions and said, hey, are you guys using facial recognition technology? And then we supplemented that with a nationally representative survey to see how many people actually knew about this. And from that, we found that 76% of people had no idea that any retailers were using facial recognition technology. We found that Kmart, Bunnings and The Good Guys were using it. The Good Guys only in 2 stores in a trial way, but Kmart and Bunnings much more widespread. In fact, we still don't know how widespread because they did not disclose that information. Hopefully they've told the Information Commissioner since then. But I think what we really learned from that is that obviously when we went out with a media release on that story, like the impact was like beyond anything that I was remotely expecting. You know, from my perspective, facial recognition was an area that had been talked about, and we know about Clearview, we know even about 7-Eleven, but perhaps it didn't make such a big impact. So that kind of made me reflect on like, what was it about the Kmart and Bunnings-ness of it that, you know, and I think it was the everydayness of it. I think it was that almost every Australian has been to a Kmart or a Bunnings. It's the place, you know, if you have kids, you've had to go there for 1,000 birthday presents. I feel like I'm constantly there. You know, and the Bunnings snag and the kind of the role of that in Australian culture. So I think it was a really kind of a shocking example just how far this technology has crept into our everyday lives. And also, you know, when we had the previous information from MOAC surveys, there was a lot there about people actually are somewhat comfortable with a law enforcement use. It's a bit unclear. Some people are like quite concerned about the threat of terrorism, you know, and I don't know how legitimate some of these threats are. You know, so a lot of the conversation up to that point had really been about those kind of government use and policing use. And I think probably Ed and Jake will speak more to that. But I think what was really interesting about the Bunnings Kmart example was that commercial use and that potential for that commercial use. And that once we start talking about private companies and corporations maintaining databases of people who they deem desirable and not desirable and start mediating access to essentially places that we all need to go to shop, I think that brought a different dimension to it. So that's just a little bit of context of how we came into that work. And then with the stadiums, again, it was a similar kind of idea. You know, from an advocacy perspective, we're looking at ways that we can kind of keep the issue alive and to kind of motivate governments to act, to regulate. And part of that reason for doing the stadium story was that. But again, I think it's really about a proliferation of use through our society and in places where we just might not expect. And again, I think, you know, people who've been to a sporting match, who've been there with their family, anyone who's been to a concert, it's just not somewhere where you necessarily expect to see that kind of biometric collection or that kind of surveillance. And similarly with the retail example, it's very, very hard to properly notify people and to get their consent in a crowd environment like that. It's not the same as a hard point of entry, say like a border, where you know that there's a hard border there, and you're kind of aware that there might be some kind of data collection. So these kind of large crowd-based environments where you'll go into the space, and in fact, we went out to Kudos Bank Arena, which was one of the stadiums that we identified was using it, and timed how long it would take you to go and find the sign. And it was about 3-ish minutes, but then when you do find the sign, that's when we were looking for it. Sign takes about 12 minutes to read. So if you can imagine, as I'm going to be there in 2 weeks, if they let me in, to go and see Lizzo, you can imagine I'm there with 20,000 rabid Lizzo fans. Am I going to be finding the sign and finding the one mention of facial recognition? And of course, even if I did, I'm not going to turn around and go home after I've waited months to go. But we had in fact passed 7 cameras by the time we even found that sign. So actually, the information's already been captured. You're already part of that system. There's no information in the ticketing website about these systems. You have to go to the venue's website. I don't know if anyone here, I can do a show of hands, anyone ever been to a venue website to read the conditions of entry? Oh, look, nobody. One person. Was it after my investigation? No, yeah. You're just one of those people. I'm also now one of those people who reads terms and conditions and privacy policies. It's gross. It's a giant waste of time. It's not like I really have a choice. So, you know, I think that's kind of the context of how we came into it. But I think it does really kind of push the case forward of why the time is right now for regulation. This isn't just governments. This isn't just police. We're seeing a proliferation across commercial uses. And we really just don't have any controls over how they might continue to use that data in the future.
Speaking of regulation.
What a segue.
That's your cue.
Yeah. Thanks very much for having me, Kim, and it's great to join you all. I was having this really interesting conversation with an academic yesterday, and when it all got to the heated part of the conversation, he said to me, look, are you in favour of facial recognition or are you against it? Oh, that was a really interesting question. To me, it's like saying, are you in favour of rocks or are you against rocks? Like, neither of those things, right? I'm not a cheerleader for technology, nor am I inherently against it. I think the context really matters. How you use the technology really, really matters. And from my perspective as a human rights lawyer, this is an area that is largely unregulated. And that's a really big problem because I'm probably like many of you, I use facial recognition on my phone to unlock my smartphone. The design of that particular use case is such that it's relatively safe. By contrast, when the New South Wales Police use facial recognition technology as they do, it is not safe at all. It's really problematic. And the fact that our law doesn't differentiate between those two things is really important. The second just prefatory comment I wanted to make was both Kim and Kate have quite rightly referred to the Australian Privacy Regulator, the OEIC's research, primarily polling research with the Australian community on facial recognition. And a lot of that data is really, really unhelpful. I'm part of the problem. When I was Human Rights Commissioner, we commissioned some polling data on this as well. It's unhelpful because those really high-level answers don't differentiate between those different use contexts, and they really need to. So what we did when we were thinking about what we need by way of regulation in this space was we decided to work with some fantastic colleagues to put people in realistic scenarios, not real, but realistic scenarios about how facial recognition is being used now and how it's starting to be used. So I'm just going to walk you through one of those scenarios. The scenario was you're using facial recognition instead of a ticket to enter a sporting stadium, which feels particularly relevant given the wonderful work that Kate's been doing. Yeah, exactly, right? So your face is now your ticket. So that's the kind of scenario. I'm going to show you me going through the simulation. It's genuine facial recognition. So that is the expression that I have before I watch my sporting team lose, which is what they do very reliably. No, because I know they're going to lose. Like I've pre-processed my emotions. Anyway, so that's what I look like as the photo's being taken. And then the kind of readout that you can start to get now is this, right? So I am who I claim to be, but this is actually, one of the more kind of interesting uses of facial recognition, not to identify who I am, let alone verify my identity, but rather to assess something about me, what's known as facial analysis. And just to be very clear, it's junk science, right? Like it doesn't work, but it's very, very influential, right? So it works in the same way. I'm happy to kind of get into the science of it later. But it is essentially just a machine learning algorithm that tries, it's the accumulated wisdom and unwisdom of a bunch of labellers about, what different expressions might indicate about you. So there, I was assessed as being too aggressive to get into the stadium, the hypothetical stadium. What the person, so, if you sort of open the door to the sausage factory a little bit and see what you would actually get as a readout, so not as someone trying to get into the sports stadium, but rather someone who is kind of maintaining security. You get a readout a little bit like what you can see behind me now. So some of those things are facts about me. It got the age pretty close. It got the gender or sex right. But as you see, as you go down that list, some of those things are very, very evaluative. So I particularly want to pay tribute to Niels Walters, who was the creator of Biometric Mirror, who we worked with really, really closely on this. What I think is really interesting about this is, and I'm going to use a $3 term really quickly here, is the phenomenon of algorithmic deference. So I've told you this is junk science, a lot of this stuff, but it looks really, really powerful and plausible, and it gives you a clear answer. And so as much as this is bullshit, it's really difficult to unsee it or to ignore it. And that's one of the reasons why it can have an outsized influence. And again, one of the reasons why the fact of this being largely unregulated is problematic. So just to kind of circle forward a bit, there's been a lot of work in this space. So when I was at the Human Rights Commission, we did work in this area. We didn't actually call for a complete moratorium on the use of facial recognition. We don't have a problem with its use in areas like your mobile phone. It was the moratorium was its use to make decisions with a legal or similarly significant effect. That's where we called for a moratorium, and at least until effective regulation can be put in place. There was, of course, the privacy regulator's determination. There's been quite a lot of work in this space. The Attorney General has commissioned and done a 2-year report on privacy reform. We know what the answers need to be, but there's been a kind of a lack of prioritisation on the part of government to actually implement it so far. So I'm just going to throw up a little kind of image of some of the reports that are out there. And then finally, I'm happy to share this separately. This is kind of a summary on a page, what our approach would be to a law for facial recognition. The short version of this is we support risk-based regulation. In other words, there are some uses and some sort of forms of the technology that are relatively lower risk and therefore should be subject to lighter regulation. And then as the risk increases or the reliability of the technology deteriorates, then of course the regulation should be more stringent, to the point that with the highest risk category, it should be prohibited. And so that's essentially the approach that we've taken. To date, actually, the Attorney General and the department gave in principle endorsement to the approach we've laid out, which is really good. The Attorney General is on record, back from his time in opposition, as saying we need legislation in this space. For us, what we, I guess, want to see is the colour of his money. We want to see reform in this space go forward.
Thanks very much. It's an honour to sit with all of you here and talk about this stuff. I've made some notes on my phone, so I'm not checking my messages as I'm... yes, there is this emerging world of facial recognition regulation, and I think it's important. At the moment, privacy and data protection laws seem to be doing a lot of the heavy lifting around the regulation of facial recognition, which does make a lot of sense because historically these are the regimes we've used to regulate biometric surveillance, to regulate the creation and circulation of images. And in Australia, as Ed mentioned, we've seen some investigations and determinations and now cases moving through the Administrative Appeals Tribunal where data privacy has been used to challenge facial recognition, and we have other jurisdictions where privacy heads of human rights instruments have been used to bring actions against particular applications of facial recognition. But I think all of us agree that these approaches are too limited, are not working very well. I've written a piece for Reader's book that talks about how I think that as we learn more about how these types of technologies work, the privacy and data protection frameworks start to diminish in competence and coherence in this facial recognition context. So I do agree that new biometric and facial recognition approaches are absolutely necessary regulatory steps, and it's great that we're seeing discussions around sui generis regimes such as the one that has been proposed here. Strategies, and we're seeing similar approaches in AI regulation more broadly that might themselves wrap up facial recognition within these sorts of risk assessment frameworks that would impose various procedural requirements for different levels of risk in different applications. And I'm tentatively very supportive of these kinds of new approaches. And I think that they're especially effective at managing particular applications of facial recognition. But I do think that there are other elements of the facial recognition ecosystem that privacy, data protection, and even these risk-based approaches do not really address adequately or at all. And while the risk-based approaches may very meaningfully address applications by police or by Bunnings or 7-Eleven or stadiums, what they don't address is something like what we might understand to be the facial recognition supply chain, which is the sort of totality of the facial recognition industry that imposes its own forms of problems and harms. Now, that these proposed laws don't necessarily operate here isn't a huge shock, because risk assessment regimes presuppose that while certain applications ought to be controlled, this facial recognition industry should indeed exist. And it accepts that facial recognition has a place in society, and implicitly that this is a kind of industry we ought to support and nurture. And I do think that this is a space where we can make a normative intervention, and I'm not sure that it's fair to compare rocks and facial recognition, because one is the product of sort of the cosmic and geological forces that create and nourish life, and the other is a product of corporate and policing interests that express, that oppress and exploit us. So, you know, this industry that is sort of beyond the application level, that operates and functions beyond this application level, is big, and it's harmful in its own way. So what am I talking about, right? So this is not just the software and hardware providers that would be selling to Bunnings or the stadiums. It's the companies that are involved in building data sets used in training and benchmarking of facial recognition algorithms and models. It's the creation of databases and indexes of searchable images. It's effectively the facial image component of the AI training dataset industry, valued at about $10 billion US a year, which is really hardly trivial. And it involves image scraping, aggregation, labeling, templating, surreptitious photography, city councils selling CCTV footage to industry, cafes creating data sets out of their webcams of customers waiting in line for coffees, universities taking photos of their students walking back and forth to classes, university researchers building data sets by availing themselves of legal exceptions and then making them open and available to corporate actors who use them for profit. I've started to think about facial recognition as like a kind of mushroom. You know, there are lots of different types of mushrooms. Some of them are delicious. Some are deadly, some are medicinal, some are indeed illegal. And the mushrooms that pop up out of the ground are kind of like these facial recognition applications that we're seeing, right? Policing, shop surveillance, stadium surveillance. But there's a lot more to the mushroom that we don't see. Underneath the soil is another critical part of the organism, this massive branched mycelial network that's processing and exchanging nutrient, that's metabolizing the soil in order to produce these fruiting bodies that we see, which then release spores that beget more fruiting bodies, more facial recognition applications. And picking the little fruiting body, the mushroom, doesn't necessarily displace that organism. And for the facial recognition mushroom, it's the image data set economy that is that subterranean network. It's a whole infrastructural ecology of biometric search engines, training and benchmarking products that are constantly being produced and traded. Privacy does a very bad job at regulating this space. Its concepts, personal and sensitive data, consent, the way it understands what a biometric template is, the way it understands what an image is, just become entirely incoherent, really. And the cases that have come down, I think, are doctrinally very weak, and it's not a secure ground in which to protect people. There's also the issue that once you disaggregate these vertical supply chains that of the companies that have been sort of taken on, like Clearview AI, if one company is doing one part of the supply chain, like aggregating images or building the model or doing the benchmarking, then they avoid these kinds of regulations. There are some specific biometric privacy laws that have been used in this instance. There was a case against IBM for its scraping of Flickr to produce the YFCC100M, that's 100 million photograph data sets scraped from Flickr of people's faces, but these cases are not succeeding, not on biometric privacy laws and not on the unjust enrichment claims that are also involved. And the risk assessment paradigm actually doesn't address this stuff either. So there is a question of why should we care? Like, why is this important to regulate? Why is it harmful? And I think, you know, there's a few things. So in the Clearview AI determination, the harm was effectively defined by the fact that Australians' images had been non-consensually consensually aggregated into an identification database that was made available to police. And that those individuals would not reasonably have expected their images to be scraped and held in this kind of database when only a small fraction of them would ever have any contact with law enforcement. And I now want to ask, like, is that what we actually care about, right? I mean, yes, we do, but is that all that we care about? Because if we remove the policing element from that, is everything okay, right? The Australian Federal Police got picked up on using Clearview AI, not for any reason other than they didn't do a privacy impact assessment. So is imposing a risk assessment regime here going to change that? And I think that a lot of what these new regulatory approaches trade on is a speculative imagination about facial recognition destroying anonymity in public space and enabling this real-time surveillance. I think that's a really important thing to avoid, but it doesn't actually exist yet. And what currently does exist is that our images are being collected to make facial recognition products and to make those products better in ways that we have no idea about, right? And perhaps we should be upset that our images are being used, these things, to make money for other people through products that we haven't had a chance to decide whether or not we want at all. And I think that perhaps focusing exclusively on the applications of facial recognition that are indeed pernicious and need stopping may be distracting us from how we ought to regulate these new formations in the surveillance economy, right? This is not so different to some of the outrage that's happening with respect to the pulling in of intellectual property and copyrighted materials and other forms of data into the generation of very, very large AI models. But I think what we're seeing is a degree of outrage there because you know, the settlements around data governance that gave platforms the capacity to make money through behavioral advertising are kind of breaking down because, at least in those cases, we had the facade of consent. We had the facade of consent with respect to the provision of data. And here, even that's non-existent. So that changes things a little bit. I think that what Clearview AI has made very clear is that facial recognition doesn't work in the way we used to think it works. And I think it perhaps at the same time caused a scandal because it showed us something that we kind of already knew but are uncomfortable with, which is that there isn't really such a thing as a police database anymore, right? There's just the internet. And the internet is no longer a place where humans go and browse images. The internet is itself a very large socio-technical system that browses and consumes images of humans itself, and it does it in service of the information processing industries like the facial recognition and biometrics industry. So I'll stop there.
That's terrific, and thank you to all of our panelists for those thoughts. I feel like, and by the way, Slido, people, there are questions already up on Slido. So this is great. So write more, vote for your favourite ones. But before we turn to the Slido, I feel like I should give you a right of response there, Ed, because one thing that Jake has raised there is what is actually a relatively common critique of the risk approach, risk assessment, which is that it does, in a sense, validate or assume as okay the industry that is subject to that assessment. And so I'm just wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
So the approach we took was grounded in international human rights law, particularly as it applies to Australia. I think you can take a more fundamental approach, which is to say, you know, from a perspective of public policy, do we want this at all? And I think that's a legitimate question to ask. It's just not the question that we asked. We were saying, within the scope of international human rights law, what should be permissible and what should not. I think some of the critiques of a risk-based approach that I think are most legitimate are the ones where risk is just made up. Like there's no, I'm going to sound very here, there's no clear normative foundation to risk. So what I mean is, for example, some of the approaches in Canada which have been very, very much focused on risk, they haven't actually defined what risk is really clearly. Whereas what we said is we are talking very specifically about risks to people's human rights. And I think that is within the scope of the international human rights law universe. I think that makes sense. But I completely accept that there's a bigger question that governments need to be pushed on, which is, should we outlaw this altogether? And, you know, that I guess is a question that Jake's asking.
And I have a follow-up question for Jake that's been asked on the Slido, which is, how would you go further or differently than a risk-based approach? Which seems like a good way to follow up that.
I mean, it's a really hard question, and I think it's a question that's being grappled with now across domains that deal with large models that have brought these distributional questions to light. And it's really complicated because, like, I'm not in favour of the production of new property rights that would give individuals, you know, control over this. I don't think that's the appropriate approach. I'm not in favour of, like, personality rights that would entail new forms of self-commodification. So it's very difficult. What I'm sort of more in favour of is sort of community-driven ways in which to make decisions about whether or not we want this. And so, for instance, in the, like, AI foundation model case, we're seeing people that are trying to use copyright not necessarily as a mechanism to exploit intellectual property works, but as, like, using legal tricks to effectively use it as a wedge to have large groups come together and opt out. How that might work is yet to be seen, but, you know, that's a promising approach. That's a much more promising approach, yeah. Or just ban it.
Can I respond? I think these are all really interesting and important conversations, and I have been thinking about, I think one of the questions we were posed with originally, which we haven't asked yet, but I'll answer it anyway, is privacy the right way to think about this, and what other types of ways? Is it human rights? Is it something beyond that? And this, I would have an answer to that in 3 different ways with 3 different answers, like yes, no, and maybe. So first, as an advocate, and why Choice decided to make a complaint to the Privacy Commission about Bunnings and Kmart, is that as an advocate, you're always looking at ways to push the issue forward, to test the limits of the existing law, to use the mechanisms that we have available to us. And I 100% agree that the risk with the Clearview AI case in particular, that is not the biggest problem with Clearview AI, is the scraping. I mean, that's absolutely a problem, but it's definitely not the biggest problem. I mean, the biggest problem is a database of everybody's faces for sale. Like that's the problem, and how that can be misused in various contexts, and accumulation of corporate power. And all of the rest. So in that sense, I think, yes, privacy in that instance was the right way because it was the mechanism that was available to us. In a more pragmatic way, I'd say also no, because the privacy regulator is one of the most ineffectual, under-resourced, I don't want to say useless, but, you know, like, complaints are very, very, very hard to get picked up. We were very fortunate we had other advocates say to us, don't even bother complaining to the privacy regulator because they won't do anything. We've had complaints sitting on their desk for years. And in fact, now that they did in fact pick up this investigation, they've already passed their own set deadline of 12 months to resolve the investigation. We still don't know when the determination is coming. So in a pragmatic sense, just from a very practical perspective, we regulate privacy very badly in this country, and that's not necessarily or entirely the fault of the regulator. It is incredibly under-resourced, and we just have not paid a lot of attention to enforcement of privacy law. Then you get to the question of policy and policy making, and where is the appropriate, and there's the philosophical element of policy, which again this is not a neutral technology. This technology exists in a world where we have wealth inequality like nothing we've ever seen before, accumulation of corporate power, like groups of individuals who are so rich we have to make up new numbers to account for their wealth, like extreme corporate power of big tech companies who are operating really beyond the law in many jurisdictions, including ours, and that's the policy environment in which we have to create laws. So I think you know, the way I like to think about it is that how can we be pragmatic in working within the limits that we have? And I think the model law is a really good example of still dealing with some of those questions of what are the risks to human rights here? Like, where is this really, really going to harm people in a very significant way right now? And how can we act urgently to address that? But similarly, I think it's important that we keep continuing to have these conversations about that broader context, about the accumulation of wealth and power and the ways that these are increasing the inequalities. One of the comments we most frequently get into our campaign's inbox when we do these sorts of things is, oh, but you know, I don't really care. If I'm not doing anything wrong, it's not going to affect me. And for me, that's just a stunning, stunning, you know, privilege, really, that people can say that. Certainly anybody who exists in this world who is a person of colour, who is Indigenous or a woman, knows that you can't just go about the world safely, and if you never do anything wrong, nothing bad will ever happen to you. That's just not the world that we live in. You know, as I mentioned, the world that we live in, it is one full of inequalities, and it is one, you know, like we're in a country right now, we're sitting on the unceded lands of the longest living culture in the world, and yet we're, no joke, having a conversation whether or not Indigenous people should have a voice in our parliamentary system. Like, that's the context in which these technologies exist. So I think, you know, that there's room actually for all of these conversations. As the pragmatic, as an advocate, what can we get done today? What are the mechanisms that we can use? What's the law that we could get passed within the next year or two, hopefully, hopefully sooner, and then continue to have those conversations about what's the kind of socio-cultural context in which this exists, and economic.
Just one tiny follow-up point. Sorry, Jake. I think it's just, oh yeah, the point that Kate just made about people saying, you know, if I've got nothing, if I've done nothing wrong, I've got nothing to hide, that sort of thing. That's what we were trying to confront people with by creating those simulations. Because what we did was we followed a methodology where we asked people both sides, right? Like before, when it feels like an achingly theoretical question, you know, what your concerns might be and where you might want to draw limits of the line, people were very, very permissive. But when you start to put people in a situation which is still hypothetical, but a bit more realistic, then they start to go, oh, okay, I can see how this might affect me in ways that make me feel really uncomfortable. And that's where people, I thought, started drawing much more interesting lines in terms of where the law should regulate.
I mean, I'll just quickly add that I totally agree, and more tools is better. The more legal tools we have, the better. As long as we're not expending all our political capital on only getting halfway there. That's, you know, that's, and I think, you know, that's not a controversial.
Yeah, I do love that walkthrough example. I mean, for two reasons. One is it's often actually been observed in the literature that privacy harms are a little bit theoretical until you're confronted with the results of a privacy breach, right? Until you are the victim of identity theft, or you know, until something gets out there that you would rather keep private, it's really hard to understand the impact of that risk. The other thing I like about that example that you walked through is it raises that question that's coming up, that has to come up in this context where you're seeing facial recognition in contexts like retail, contexts like public spaces, which is the question of exclusion, right? You know, actually excluding people from spaces and from participating in, you know, ordinary incidents of life like going to the stadium and seeing Lizzo, potentially on the basis of something that a technical system does. And so I think that is incredibly valuable. I have another question here from Dan Angus, which is, are there examples, and I think I'm going to direct this to Kate first, are there examples of opt-out mechanisms for facial recognition done well? You know, like not resulting in people unable to enter a venue or denied service? Like, is there any mechanism we could think of there?
Yeah, this was a question actually that I got. I spoke at the Biometrics Institute discussion day last year, and I got bailed up by a vendor going, well, how do we do it right? And, you know, can we still have it in the shops? How are we going to get people to opt out? And I said, well, maybe you have a hard border at the entry to your shop, and you have a giant sign that explains exactly what data you're collecting and why you're collecting it. And he said, no one would ever come inside. And I said, exactly. right? Like, this is like, you shouldn't be doing it, right? If people knew about it and they don't want to come inside, then don't do it. Like, it's pretty obvious, you know. So have I seen that in real life? No, I haven't. I think probably the only examples that I can think of would be the example that Ed mentioned earlier, like a fairly, I don't want to say benign, but relatively benign in the context of exclusion, your phone. So if you don't set up Face ID on your iPhone, then you're not using Face ID. You know, so I think that, you know, and actually I'm looking at this at Choice at the moment is which facial recognition systems on phones work, which our sister organisation in the UK has found that some models of phones can be fooled by a 2D image, which obviously is a problem. So we're starting to look at that. But one of the things that I've been talking to some technical experts about is, you know, the onboard processing versus cloud-based. I think you absolutely need onboard processing to maintain some level of consent and control so that no information is being sent away from the device. So have I seen, that's probably the only one I can think of where maybe there is some kind of consent mechanism that might actually work. Whether or not people fully understand what they might be consenting to, or that it is in fact an option that you can kind of swipe past that in the setup if you don't want to set it up, that's, you know, important question, but certainly definitely not in a crowd-based context. I would say in a stadium or in a retail situation, I actually think it's impossible to get consent in that kind of situation, because by the time you have entered in the space, you've already been captured.
Yeah. And it highlights the challenge of consent. But even if we don't consent to using like Face ID on our phones, every image we take of a person is running through a facial recognition analysis. Like, just try, look, you can do it on your phone now. Like, you can search by people's face, right? And like, so every image that you take is participating in this ecosystem. It's being used to train models. There's no option to not consent to that. Yeah.
Can I come back to you, Kate, and ask about the impact that you're experiencing of the work that you've done? I mean, we know that after the Bunnings and Kmart investigations hit the media in an incredibly big way, there was a kind of, at least a reported pause on their part on the use of such technologies. And you've done another investigation and you see it in the stadiums. And I'm just wondering, I mean, you are no doubt going to these industry fora and you're talking to people across various industries. You know, are you seeing an impact of this? Are people getting more, are the companies getting more thoughtful about this? Is there any kind of pause, or is it it's going to require the kind of public action that we're talking about and the legal regulation?
Thank you. Yes and no. So following the retail investigation, before Bunnings and Kmart committed to pausing, so the good guys acted fairly quickly, and I think it was easy for them to do that because they only had it in 2 stores. And it seems, in fact, that their executive and board was unaware that they even had it in those 2 stores. So they acted very quickly to shut it down. But in the Bunnings and Kmart, they did push back quite significantly. And it wasn't until after the Commissioner opened investigation and then we published a scorecard. So what we did is we approached other retailers and said, the original 25 that we'd approached them and said, would you go on the record as making a commitment to not having any plans to introduce? And some of them said, well, we're not saying never, but we're saying we won't have any plans. So that was the kind of commitment that we could get. They're like, if it becomes fully legal and 10 years from now, we don't want you to hold us to it, that we said we'd never do it. But from that, we were able to at least get commitments from the major supermarkets, from Woolworths, Coles and Aldi, and from a range of other retailers. So I think in the retail space, I think we've got a momentary pause. I did just see a post on Reddit that was sent to me yesterday that a new Bunnings store has opened, which has a sign up that says that they are using facial recognition. So we have been sending them some questions today to find out if in fact they have turned it back on, or whether or not that's just a standard sign and they intend to be using it the moment that the determination drops from the Information Commissioner. Be interesting to find out. They might not answer us. But we'll see. So then with the stadiums, they've indicated absolutely no way, like they're just not going to stop. They just haven't really responded. In fact, have been quite angry at us, which is all part of the job. And then you've got things like pubs and clubs and gaming venues. I think Ed and I both had conversations with Clubs New South Wales, and they've certainly reached out to people working in the space to have those conversations. They are still proceeding. They have currently 100 clubs in New South Wales which are using facial recognition for the purposes, they say, of self-excluded gamblers. And they plan to roll out to every club that's a member of Clubs New South Wales in the state. So yes, in some places it's pausing, in other places it's proliferating, and I think in the clubs example, some of those industry groups have said that they would like to see clearer rules, and certainly the message that I said to them is like, do not proceed until there are those rules in place. That would be the wrong thing to do, but they are anyway, so.
Oh, that's depressing. I've got a couple of questions here from the audience asking about whether we could perhaps extend a risk approach to take into account some of the other risks that we're talking about. So could we extend such approach to bring in the problems that facial analytics junk, like gender recognition, challenges principles of self-identification, self-expression, and then some of the other kinds of risks we've been talking about. Can we extend like the risk assessment beyond the sort of the things that we have already thought about in terms of the human rights principles, Ed?
I mean, yeah, the short answer is absolutely. There's no legal barrier to doing that. It's just entirely a question of policy. And I mean, the term that Kate used before to describe our approach is pragmatic, and it's exactly the right word. That is exactly what we're doing. I do think on the 14th of July, on all days, we should be thinking about storming the barricades, and we'll be following Jake behind him. But I do think we need to understand what the chances are of success of going beyond even a human rights approach in the last liberal democracy in the world that doesn't have a Human Rights Act or a Bill of Rights, right? Like I am a pragmatist, and I acknowledge that to be the case. But I want to get some reform to shoot for the best possible reform. If the consequence of that is nothing, I'm being very, very transparent. That to me is a worse outcome. I'm not saying that's what Jake or anybody else is advocating for. I'm just laying out what my concerns are.
I have a question here from Steph, which is, how do we create opportunities for people experiencing disadvantage or exclusion or homelessness to be informed about and or challenge the use of facial recognition technologies? Because it's one thing to talk about middle class people going into stadiums to watch shows, but the more important questions about a broader exclusions is equally, if not more important.
I mean, I do think good policy making takes that extra step to reach out to people who aren't normally actively listened to. So I think that's really, really important. But I think that question also preset, I'm approaching this from a slightly oblique angle, but I think that what that question also points to is the limits, one of the many, many limitations of consent, right? And that's where something, I think, that's an area where human rights advocates can perhaps learn a little bit more from consumer protections, right? So if we were having this conversation 50 years ago, you'd walk into, a car dealership and you'd be asked to sign, a contract that said if the car blows up, you leave the dealership, even if you're badly injured and it's all the manufacturer's fault, the liability is disclaimed, it's all your risk. We didn't accept that, right? Like, so 50 years ago, we changed the law to say, it's not a question of consent, some bullshit consent of some legalese form that you've been required to sign to access the product. Instead, what we've said is that there are some hard limits, and regardless of any purported contract that you might sign, you cannot go past those limits. And so that's what I think we need to do much more of in regard to facial recognition. We've actually not relied very heavily on consent because we know consent to be broken. And instead, what we're saying is we need to articulate much more clearly what are the limits of what you can and can't do, because we think those are stronger protections.
That's a really interesting question, because it sort of raises a reality that a lot of the rationale behind the development and deployment of these systems is particularly to automate decisions around what kind of person is a desirable person and what kind of person is not a desirable person in a particular space. So the idea that So how do you do that in a way that's like inclusive of that community that you're actively trying to exclude is kind of a contradiction.
Some great work in the US, by the way, from the NAACP and some of those organisations that represent people of colour, saying there is no way that we're participating in this. You may improve the quality of your outputs for people of colour by, you know, including more people of colour in your training data sets, but we know you're going to use this as a tool of oppression against us, so no, we don't consent, which yeah, I have a lot of sympathy for.
And a lot of sympathy for the idea that we need some hard rules against exclusion, right? We need hard rules against anything that's going to mean that people can't participate fully in society. Just a comment actually about the stadiums question, Andrew Kenyon noting that extremely permissive laws have been passed in France ahead of the Olympic Games of 2024 to allow very widespread use of facial recognition. This does remind me of the major sporting events scenarios we've had here in Australia too, which have been the kind of Trojan horse for all kinds of facial recognition systems. Just looking to see what other questions we have. We're nearly at time. I have a question here from Rita. What kind of research is still needed that could encourage policy action in the field? Or do we have the sufficient research? So what is missing is political will, and basically it's all on you, Kate, I guess. Yeah. We might make this an end point, you know, so make any last comments you want to make, and then we'll be done.
Yeah, we know the answer, as Ed said. It's not like this is some area where we need new research to work out what the problem is. We know what the problems are. We maybe have some of the political will, but there is a lack of action, and the reasons for that are potentially complex and have to do with a whole lot of other the landscape of politics right now, and also the fact that the Attorney General has like the world's longest agenda and many things on his plate might be some of the reason, and there's some stuff around the portfolios of Home Affairs and Attorney General and now Department of Industry that wants to get in on AI regs. So I think there's probably lots of kind of reasons why we haven't seen that, but do we need more research? More research is always welcome because we can use that as a tool to make noise, but really we just need people to act. I guess the final point I want to say is maybe around that what we haven't spoken about is I 100% agree that this has similar relationships to the way that data is being scraped and used, and there's been some really interesting kind of uses of, say, copyright and ways to fight this. But the final thing I want to say is really about faces and why potentially we need a specific law to regulate facial recognition technology is that faces have a special role in our world, that faces are how we recognise people, how we relate to people. You know, when we're asked to come to this conference, we're asked to provide headshots, you know, that how we know that our partner is pleased to see us, how we know if a joke lands, how I know if you're listening to me right now. You know, like faces actually have a very important role in our world. And so when we're talking about technologies that exploit those faces, that monetize those faces, that use those faces against us to oppress us, to control us, I do think it requires a special kind of regulation, a special kind of law, and I do also think that's why we need to act more urgently. I think we need to act urgently in all of AI regulation, but I think my final point is to just recognise the importance that faces play.
Yeah, 100% agree. I do think there's absolutely scope for more research with respect to how to reformulate data governance arrangements in the context of an economy oriented around very, very large AI models. And I think the way to do it in the facial recognition context is inevitably different from every other context, because what we care about and the dynamics that control the movement of facial images are different from other kinds of images, other kinds of data, other kinds of intellectual property. So yeah, there's way more work to be done.
Way more work to be done is the way we like to end a panel at a research conference. So we are done here, but can I ask you to thank my amazing panellists here?